Well, hello guys, and welcome back to another Casually Creative, except I think I'm going to change the name of the series to maybe just like Let's Chat or something to be a little more all-encompassing. Although again, now that I said that, it sounds way too casual for today's topic, because I want to tackle something a little bit serious and a little bit uncomfortable today, because it's something that's sort of been bothering me and it's a conversation that I think is worth having. If you don't know who John Kricfalusi is, aka John K, he's sort of a household name here in Canada and probably generally in the animation industry. He is the creator most famously for the Ren and Stimpy cartoons that played on Nickelodeon in the early 90s and on Paramount Networks through Spike TV, I think, a little bit later on as Ren and Stimpy's adult party cartoons. And just generally, he's known in the animation industry for his Spunko animation studio that I think also did some commercial work and some other projects and pitched many more shows that were never made, for better or for worse. And for his talent in recruiting talent, although now, there's some controversy around that. In the last few days, news has basically come out that's more or less what I gather now is confirming speculations and rumors that have been swirling around John K, like so many other people who are in the spotlight for the wrong reasons these days. But just recently, allegations with much more detail and much more substance came to light regarding essentially sexual assault and certainly pedophilia. And these allegations were brought forward by a couple brave victims who came forward to BuzzFeed, and from there, of course, all kinds of media networks have picked it up. And before I continue, I just want to make it really clear, the intent of this video is not to defend John Kricfalusi in any sense, and I hope it doesn't come across that way, and if it does, let me know, because it's just not my intent. I'm calling these allegations because, as far as I know, they haven't been brought to a court of law yet. There's no official charges being pressed, but John Kricfalusi's legal representation has released some statements that really don't deny any of the allegations at this point, and instead it talks about, his troubled mental health history and stuff that I think it's important to discuss that stuff. It's important to acknowledge that there are obviously mental health issues connected to these sorts of issues. But frankly, to be the very first statement that comes out of John Kricfalusi, and not even directly, that he has not, to my knowledge, apologized to anyone. He's not personally come forward to discuss this or to show any remorse. But through his legal representation, they're making these statements on his behalf. Frankly, it just comes across as nothing but excuses, and in my mind is just rubbing salt in the wounds of his victims. I can only imagine, what they're going through, and to just sort of hear what just comes across as a sob story in the context of the very first response from John Kricfalusi, in my mind is very distasteful, and let's be honest, that is hardly the first distasteful or inappropriate thing that we've ever seen from this fellow. So needless to say, I think like so many animation fans, I am super disillusioned and just kind of heartbroken to hear about all this. Specifically though, I've seen quite a number of posts in the mainstream media, and even more so here on YouTube, that have suggested more or less that as a society or as a community or as an industry, animators and or animation fans should have seen this coming based purely on the content of Ren and Stimpy, the cartoons. That John Kricfalusi is so clearly a creep through his output, through his creative content, that A, we should have seen this coming, B, Ren and Stimpy never deserved to be as popular as it was, C, that based on the content of Ren and Stimpy, there should have been some investigation or who knows what. That sort of seems to be what's inferred by some of these videos. And yes, John Kricfalusi has made some really distasteful comments in interviews, and that's totally valid. And I mentioned this in a couple list videos, one I published last Wednesday and one I just published this Saturday, that talk about Ren and Stimpy in the context of Canadian children's shows and in the context of banned and recalled kids show episodes. I mentioned that it's really sad that this, of all the things that basically caused the Ren and Stimpy show to be recalled at various times, to be banned, for there to be legal troubles with the network, for John Kricfalusi to stop communicating with Nickelodeon. There's been all these issues with the history and the production of that show, and none of them, to my knowledge, has been related to John Kricfalusi's behavior, even though we now know, based on these media reports that are coming out, that he literally was unsolicited going around and showing child pornography, essentially, to coworkers. And not just child pornography, but stuff that's actually related to the case brought forward by one of the victims. In other words, child pornography that he was creating. and perpetuating. So if your argument is that somebody should have known and somebody should have flagged this earlier and somebody should have taken more responsibility for what a lot of people seem to know what was going on, totally. And I'm not saying that in any way to blame the victims. I just sort of wish that somebody had checked in with them at some point, and I don't know that that ever happened. And if nothing else, certainly somebody could have brought forward allegations of possession of child pornography to the police a lot earlier, right? But to my knowledge, none of that actually has anything concretely to do with John Kricfalusi's animation. And it has even less to do with the Ren and Stimpy Show. So yeah, he does have a history of really problematic behavior, and that should have been a red flag a long time ago. But to suggest that, his art itself was abusive or was sick or was prophetic of this behavior, I think is just taking it too far and is not just hurtful, but it's dangerous. And I think it's dangerous in terms of prosecuting artists who are unconventional or who push boundaries or who do things that are strange or extreme or grotesque as a form of creative expression. But it's also dangerous in terms of not catching people because you're looking for what in my mind are false flags. You're looking in the wrong place instead of actually having a safe workplace and inherently requiring a safe workplace and making sure that you have policies in place basically to catch this kind of thing. So what are these videos posting specifically? Well, I've seen a lot of clips that suggest that John Kricfalusi basically was always just putting out really smutty, gross, manipulative, sexualized animation. He has talked about and has created female characters that are, the kind of classic 30s or 40s or 50s inspired. This is not a new thing, which is another point I'll get to, but these retro cartoons of women in a very objectified context where they are basically sex symbols and nothing else and have no other personality and no other purpose. And maybe there's some cases where that would be justified if it's a commentary on human behavior of some kind, and there's other contexts where it's essentially just pornography, and if you want to take a stance against pornography, I think that's perfectly fair. However, what is not fair is to cherry pick in an industry that's, let's face it, is still overrun to this day with hundreds, if not thousands, of franchises and properties and ongoing series that have made absolutely zero attempt to bring gender parity to their characters or to show women in truly realistic ways, but where the females always have to look a certain way and act a certain way, and they might be strong characters, but they're not nuanced characters or vulnerable, complex, realistic characters the way that the male characters more often are. So that's my first issue, right? If you're gonna say that the scantily clad women in John Kricfalusi's cartoons is, evidence that he was some kind of sexual deviant, then you're gonna end up throwing half of Hollywood in prison. And certainly half of the animation industry, probably the entire male half, right? And I'm not, again, that sounds like a defense and it's not. Maybe we should throw 90% of male animators in prison. I think we definitely need to start a much bigger conversation around this. But again, you have to judge the merit of these projects, of the characters, in the context of those stories. If you have to rely on the fact that the creator, or tie it into the fact that the creator's personality is problematic or unlikable or criminal, in my mind, you've already lost that argument. And not to say that the two aren't connected and it's not worth discussing. The people who are perpetuating these old stereotypes are perpetuating a culture that also is more acceptable of really immoral, if not criminal behavior and violence against women. And that's something that's totally worth discussing. But again, I just don't think it's helpful to cherry pick and decide that we're going to eliminate the problem by tearing apart the creative products of people who have been successfully targeted by the Me Too movement. This is much bigger than that, and it deserves to be looked at on a much broader level. What I'm also specifically seeing is a lot of clips from Ren and Stimpy that people are suggesting is, again, evidence of some kind of sexual deviant inherent behavior. And these aren't clips that show necessarily even scantily clad women. They're just really crude, bizarre sexual humor. My biggest issue is that these aren't actually taken from the Ren and Stimpy Show. These are taken from Ren and Stimpy Adult Party Cartoon. Why is that distinction important? Well, I put in my list video, I said, Ren and Stimpy doesn't belong on the list of strangest Canadian kids shows because it's not really a kids show. But the fact is, it was on Nickelodeon, right? And I don't think it was really appropriate there. But that wasn't John Kricfalusi's sole decision. That was the decision of Nickelodeon. They played when to air it, how to market it, they bought it. John Kricfalusi has some responsibility in that, but I think he was basically trusting an audience to self-select, and I think for the most part they did. I don't think a lot of really young kids were watching Ren and Stimpy, and it became pretty obvious pretty soon that the series might find more fans, in fact, on an adult TV network, and then John Kricfalusi was paid to create Ren and Stimpy Adult Party Cartoon, which I understand was an initiative of Paramount through Spike TV, and it wasn't actually John Kricfalusi's idea. I'm sure he was happy to do it, but they specifically commissioned an adult comedy show, basically a sex comedy show on a male-centric adult late-night TV network, right? So these YouTube channels now are showing clips from Adult Party Cartoon and suggesting that it's a kid's show, and that proves how inappropriate and irresponsible John K. was. First of all, that wasn't marketed to children, and I can see that maybe children would go, oh, it's Ren and Stimpy, but they shouldn't be watching Spike TV in the first place, and that's a whole other issue. And secondly, again, it was a sex comedy, and obviously it's going to have sexual innuendos and sexual content and some weird graphic sexual stuff. To suggest that anyone who makes a bizarre sex comedy is therefore a sexual predator, or to suggest that anyone who makes really violent cartoons or horror movies is a murderer is absurd, and frankly, they need to stop. Animation is sort of a fun mirror for human behavior, and it always has been, and I think it always will be. It's a reflection of our hypocrisy, our violence, our sexuality, and in some cases a celebration of our eccentricities. So to take clips from Ren and Stimpy's Adult Party Cartoon, it's not quite as bad as taking like fan fiction from a hentai site and presenting it as canon for an anime series, but it's still pretty bad, right? It's not accurate, and I certainly don't think it's helpful to the Me Too movement. And if we're determining the justification for a character's attributes or behaviors, that argument should stand on its own within the product, especially keeping in mind that Ren and Stimpy wasn't only created by John Kricfalusi, and none of these, basically, very, very, very few film projects are ever created by one person. Well, obviously there's always a director, there's always a writer. Everything was somebody's idea or multiple people's idea, but it's so oversimplistic and problematic to start connecting the two in the way that we do. Certainly people like myself who are not trained psychologists and don't know the people that we're commenting on. And in the examples of sex comedies, are we going to start taking issue with Seth Rogen because of Sausage Party, or, you know, Robert Zemeckis because of Jessica Rabbit and Who Framed Roger Rabbit? You know, there's always been these hypersexualized characters, and in some contexts, it's a very conscious commentary, and I think it serves the stories, and in other cases, it might be inexcusable, and if it's inexcusable, it shouldn't be presented on TV. I'm not saying we should prosecute Robert Zemeckis or Seth Rogen, or that we shouldn't, but I think those examples deserve every bit as much scrutiny if we're going to start examining the content in this way. But I haven't actually seen any arguments about the Ren and Stimpy show that are even making the argument that it doesn't serve the story, or that the story isn't a greater political commentary. On the contrary, I happen to think, as much as I'm disgusted by John Kricfalusi, and knowing all this is a total killjoy for me, and I'll never be able to watch those cartoons the same way, I can't in good conscience just pretend that those cartoons don't exist, or that they didn't influence me, or that they haven't had a positive impact in some ways on the animation industry, and that they're not worth studying. But let's not just assume that the cartoon was as shitty as the person who created it. This case is particularly complex and interesting because these victims, if you're not aware, were basically recruited by John Kricfalusi, but they reached out to him and he brought them on as proteges, essentially as apprentices, because they had expressed an admiration and fascination for his animation. And I mean, that's what's so sad about this case in particular, and what's so despicable about it. And one of the victims, I believe, basically understandably lost her passion for animation altogether, and I think the industry lost a great talent that way. But I think it's important too to acknowledge that those people saw something in Kricfalusi's animation that they were drawn to. And it's not to say, oh, well, they thought it was great, so it must be okay. But I am saying those people were influenced by Kricfalusi's art and his style and his animation because thousands of people were. It was extremely influential because it was different, and frankly, Kricfalusi was good at what he did as an animator. And I really hope that some of the talent and creativity that this has spawned maybe can be used to actually address some of the issues that we're talking about. I guess what I'm saying at the end of the day is, if you enjoyed or watched or even were just aware of the Ren and Stimpy show and never felt justified before to accuse its creator of pedophilia or of sexual violence solely based on the merits of that show for the last 30 years that it's been out, don't start suggesting that anyone else should have been so wise. It's absolutely ridiculous, and it's insane, and it's hurtful, and it's dangerous to start conflating those two things. We can judge artists for their art. That's absolutely fair. We can judge people for their personalities. But when we start retroactively judging people for their art, then we start going down a slippery slope to a creative dystopia where people are afraid to express their opinions through art or just to exercise their natural creative intuition. Animation is used to vent frustration. It's used to reflect on the life that we see. It's used to vent frustrations. It's used to let out steam, frankly. And I think people, like any artist in any art form, people use it to try and understand themselves better. And shutting that down on a very unjustified, unscientific paranoia that it somehow could hint at or perpetuate or create criminal behavior does not become okay now, because we are now talking about important issues that are happening within the film industry. I'm also not really suggesting that anyone should stop watching Ren and Stimpy or should continue watching Ren and Stimpy. I think that's a decision that you have to make for yourself. For myself, I haven't been able to watch a clip or an episode without thinking about all of this since hearing the news, and it's a total killjoy, and it just has taken all the fun out of it for me. I still think I'm going to continue to reference the series in some aspects. I know it has been influential for me, and that influence doesn't stop now that I'm aware of this unsavory details. It doesn't mean that I'm going to start pretending that these animations just don't exist. They're clever, they're provocative, and they're just really fucking well animated, and that stuff doesn't change. And if I were to teach a class on animation, heaven forbid, I'm totally unqualified and I would have to give a refund to all of my students. But I would have to bring up Ren and Stimpy. I feel like it would have to be part of the curriculum, and this conversation would be maybe the most important part of that. But I don't think you can really have this conversation when you're simultaneously judging people who admire the cartoon for what it is or recognize how influential it was. Does all that make sense? I think it does. I don't know. I obviously haven't processed all of this for myself yet. It's always a tricky issue. For the most part, I haven't watched any of the content of any of the people who have been involved in Me Too since the allegations for those respective people have come out, and I don't think I will. It's something that I struggle with. Fundamentally, I think one can separate the art from the artist in terms of can morally, but practically, can you? I think it's really hard. I can't do it. But right now, when I watch these YouTube videos that show clips from Our Party cartoon and suggest how problematic it is, and that John Kricfalusi somehow should have been busted on the basis of the cartoons he created and not the child pornography that he was sharing in the office or whatever, it's just absurd to me, and it's kind of scary and problematic. So that's just something I wanted to share, and let me know what you think. I feel like my mind could probably be changed on this one. I'm really curious what you guys think. It's something that's definitely been on my mind all week, and I think it will continue to be on my mind for quite some time. And to end on a little bit of a lighter note, guys, I just realized that in all the notes I wrote for this video, believe it or not, I wrote notes. I know you can't even tell because I was so inarticulate, but it's changed Ren and Stimpy in every instance through spell check to Ken and Stumpy. So I might be done with Ren and Stimpy, but if someone makes a Ken and Stumpy cartoon, I'll definitely check it out. Thanks so much for watching, guys, and stay tuned for next Saturday. I'm going to have another kind of much more organized, fun, quick list video. I'm getting more into kind of the quirky side of Canadian TV shows for kids, and I'm going to start doing more stuff on strange film history, which is what I really want to focus on this channel. The list stuff is good, I think, to kind of maybe invite some new viewers in, capture a broader audience. But I'm really more fascinated with the strange stories, the little quirky films and studios and unknown filmmakers that we don't talk about enough here on YouTube. So that's the stuff I'm excited to get to. I hope you guys come along with me for that journey. Be sure to hit the subscribe and the bell notification button if you haven't already to catch all of that content when it comes up. Thanks again for watching and for any of the comments below, and I'll catch you guys next time.